Well, hello there. My name is Matt Petrowski. Let me switch over here, and there we go. Welcome to this video. We are going to be taking a look at value lists today. This is part 6 in a series that I'm shooting. Let's switch over and take care of that music. We are talking about FileMaker. We're learning FileMaker. This is a beginning series, and this is pretty much a brain dump of everything that I know about FileMaker, taking the approach of from a beginner. I've never opened FileMaker. I'm just going to go through all the areas, and we're walking through all of the manage areas. These are the primary areas where you are going to be interacting with FileMaker. Occasionally you'll see me look off to the side. I've got another monitor here where I'm able to see all of the different things that are going on, my audio setup, switching video, etc., which means that we're going to switch to my desktop here, like so that I can be down here in the corner and give you a view of the video or my desktop as I'm working and what's going on. So let's jump into the content. Managing value lists, that's what we're taking a look at here. We've already taken a look at the managed database, or as I know it, defined database. We've gone through security. We've gone through layouts. I've mentioned in the very first 2 videos of this series that the most of the time you'll be spending in FileMaker is here, here, and here. That's layouts, scripts, and database. But you must know about your security, which I covered pretty early on in order to give you an intro. Now we're going to cover value lists. So as I bring this dialog up, if you do not have this database loaded and you would like to follow along, let me show you that really quickly in case this is the video that you just happen to be coming into. You can go up to the File menu, and there will, in this menu, provided no FileMaker file is already opened and you're working with a copy of FileMaker 16 or a later copy, it may be in 15 as well. It'll say get started, I believe, is what it'll say. And I'm not going to take the time to do that right now. You should see that if you have no files open, you've got a more recent copy version of FileMaker 14, 13. If you're working with the older versions, it may not. Now, one of the good things about these videos is that probably 90% of what we're covering here has been the same in FileMaker for decades, for a long time, in terms of how FileMaker works underneath. Many times they'll rearrange the menus and things like that, but this value list dialog, the scripts, the way that you define your database, the way that you manage your relationships, they really haven't changed. So if you're using a much later copy of FileMaker, chances are it has not changed too much. So here we go through the manage value lists. So as I zoom in here, we took a look at the manage layouts and the manage database, and there's this menu that we find up in the top where we can view by. And basically this just gives us our different ways that we can see all of the different items in the particular lists that we're working with. Creation order will give you a little bit of clue in terms of the evolution of the database. So if you're ever wondering yourself, when did I create this value list? Was it created later in the lifetime of the file, or was it something that I created, earlier on? If you created it earlier on, maybe it has been superseded by another value list. So creation order is helpful there. We have by name, which basically is the same thing as clicking on the header right here. Pretty obvious. We have the source, which is basically going to sort those as the type of value list, which we're going to be taking a look at. In fact, this particular video, rather than just going through the dialog, we're actually going to go into the layout and see how value lists impact what you design. And then custom order, as we've seen in the managed database and also in the value lists, can be something where you can rearrange and you can control this. Now, if you don't remember from one of the earlier videos, as I mentioned, whatever this value list is set to on the view by, prior to uploading the file, that's what will stick, so that the next time you open this, after the database has been closed, it will default to that view. So if you want to default your value list as you're developing to a name view, you're either going to need to click on the column or choose the value list by name from the selection list. Now, I won't go over the new, edit, delete, duplicate. These are all pretty obvious in terms of what you're going to be able to do. Of course, edit the buttons, most everything in FileMaker, you can simply just double click. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with the status item because, first off, it's one of your most basic value lists possible. It is the custom values. So when we double click this line, we get our edit value list. Now the edit value list, the most basic FileMaker value list that you could ever have in your FileMaker database is a static value list. This is something where the values don't change unless you go in and intentionally change them. We can see right here that the use custom values is basically allowing us to put in all of the individual values that we want. So for the status of an invoice, this pretty much makes sense. I'm going to have unpaid, paid, and then overdue, due tomorrow, due today, etc. Now the one thing to note, and we saw this in the layouts section, is this little dash right here actually makes the separator in FileMaker. So I actually want to zoom in a little bit more so that we can really see what's going on. So if I wanted a separator in between overdue and due, I would simply just put in a single dash. Now again, I mentioned this, I believe, when we looked at the layouts section just a couple videos ago. This also applies within scripts. Within layouts, if you remember, the dash actually is a separate layout. And in scripts, as we're going to see, creating a separator within scripts is an actual script of a dash. However, in value lists, that is not the case. When you add a dash here, it is simply just FileMaker is going to see the single dash, and that's what it's going to use in order to render a separator in between different items. So let's talk about what some of the shortcomings are of using custom values, at least with regards to your solution and allowing users to actually control values. Whatever is here is pretty much all you get. The only time that this particular list can be modified is if you, one, give the user the ability to modify this list, or two, you come in and modify this yourself as a developer with access. This is a developer area. You are working on your FileMaker database, but that's pretty much the only two ways that you can modify this list if you want to use a custom values. Now, the great thing about a value list is that the value list itself can come from the contents of a field. So in the world of FileMaker, what happens is, as you put values into a field, those values are accumulated, and FileMaker creates what's called an index. The index is basically the same thing that you find at the end of a book. It's basically a list of pointers to where all of these particular items or all of these particular pieces of data exist. So for example, if all of these were within a field, the values of paid versus unpaid, you would have a lot of different records. Let's say you have 50 different invoices. Well, you're going to have a combination of, let's say, paid, unpaid, overdue, and due. And that index points to, okay, which records actually are set to paid versus unpaid? Well, maybe records 1, 5, 6, and 8 are actually paid, and the rest are set to some other status. The index points to those records. But when it comes to a value list, what FileMaker does is if you point to a field for a value list, it simply pulls out just one of all of those values. It doesn't take into account records 1, 6, 8, or whatever records I mentioned. It only pulls out one of those, and we'll take a look at that. That option of where you can actually say, hey, I want a field to actually represent the values that are possible to choose from is right here. It is the use values from field. Now this applies to values within this specific file. And the great thing about this particular option is this is the dynamic option. So think about this one as the static option. It's fixed. You only have one other way that users can actually modify this, and we'll look at it. Here you have a completely dynamic option. It's basically values that are accumulated, and as they are accumulated, they become available to be selected from with regards to the list. Now, your third option in this dialog box in the Manage Values is to use a value list from another file. Now, you can save this one for later when you get into more advanced FileMaker development. In fact, honestly, in my 20 years, I've only used this probably a few times. And that really only comes into play when you're going to connect multiple files and you know that the value list is over in the other file, and because that's where the data is. This really comes in when, let's say, for example, you are creating multiple FileMaker systems, and you want to have a centralized collection of contacts that work company-wide. Well, you can break all of those contacts out into their own separate file, and then you can reference that file from, let's say, a file that's dealing with shipping, where the shipping department can use that. But accounting, you're going to create a separate file for them, and they're going to also need access to those accounts. That's when you would connect multiple different files. It's when you start to segment out your larger FileMaker system into smaller chunks, because it allows you to distribute load. Well, if you wanted a value list of all of the different types of contacts that you have, let's say, you can basically reference that file, and you're going to do that by selecting this option here. So most of the time, as you're developing, what you're going to do is be using this one or this one, and I'll be honest with you, as a professional FileMaker developer, I rarely use this one anymore. I rarely use the custom values. I typically allow users to drive the values or the content, or I do what's called pre-populating the value list with the same values that I would put normally here in the use custom values. So all of these values that are here, I would normally put those into a dedicated table, into a dedicated field, and then I would put unpaid, paid, etc. The one shortcoming that we're going to have with that, however, is you don't get to control the display order. So in this dialog, what happens is if I want paid to show up first, and I put paid here in front of unpaid, I get to control the display order so that when this list is presented to the user, they get exactly what's listed here. When you choose to use values from a field, you do not get to control the order as precisely as you do here with custom values. And I wish FileMaker would change that. There are a few advanced techniques that you can actually try to control it, but it's really this obscure way of actually adding invisible characters in front of the actual characters that the user reads. So, topic for another video at another time, way down the road. So let's take a look at a value list here in the invoices database that uses values from another field. I'll click cancel here, and we will move our dialog up. Let's take, for example, any one of these that say from field, and let's use job title. We'll bring that one up. So in this one, we can see that we're using values from a field. That means that the users, as they add values to a field, those values become available. Now this, out of the two different types of value lists that you'll have when you choose this option. Now, we need to think about this. How many types of value lists do we have in terms of what we can use in FileMaker? Well, we have 3. We have 1, which is custom fixed values. We have 2, which comes from a field. And then we have 3, which can come from another value list that's already created in another file. Within the value lists that you create from a given field, there are 2 different variations of those. And one of them is just a straight give me the values. You know, what are the values? I'm going to populate those into a particular field. And here we can see this is the first of those 2 different variations. The first one says we're going to use values from a field. You get to specify whatever table you want, and you can see that we're not actually specifying the table underneath. We're specifying the table occurrence. That's that ghost that I talked about, or the alias shortcut, however you want to think about it, that's on the relationship graph. Go back a few videos if you haven't watched it, and you can see that the order that context is established from is from the layout view, looks at the table occurrence, which looks at the underlying table. Everything that you do in FileMaker is through the perspective of the table occurrence and what data it can actually see. So here we're saying we want to get all of the values that are currently entered into the field of job title. And you're going to give us those values back. And it's returning all of the values. So in other words, right now there is no limit. If all of the different job titles that are entered into this invoices database end up being 10, 20, and then 50, you're going to have a value list that when presented and selected, the user will have to choose from 50 of those options. So here's a developer tip. You always need to think about what is the direction that I'm going to take the user down in terms of a path. If you know that job title is pretty much going to be limited to a small subset or 10 different items, that's easy for a user to choose from. However, if you know that down the road there may be 70 different items, that's a lot more difficult for a user to actually sit there and pick across 70 items. So you have to rethink how you're going to present the user the options that they can actually choose from. Just a little tip if you get down the road and you know that there might be a lot of values. Now, one of the more complex options that we find here is include only related values from starting from a given point. This is really hinging on context, and we're going to have to take a look at this down the road as we develop a database, which I'm still thinking of what example database I want to use that we can develop. But when you choose this, what it's going to do is you're going to have to choose a particular table occurrence that's related based on the context where the user is actually working with the data. So again, this all ties to the layout. If the user's on a layout, their context is based on that table occurrence, and their perspective is what can they see. Now, if you have a relationship from that table occurrence to another table occurrence that, let's say, whittles down or narrows the selection of what the user can choose from, then that's going to provide a smaller subset. So here's how we think about this. If I was to, say, for example, use let's use the example that we were already going through, where we are going to provide all of the different possible job titles to a particular user. And throughout the course of a year, let's say it's 2016 and it's a really popular year and there's 50 different job titles. Well, we've now moved into 2017 or 2018, and some jobs that were in 2016 aren't as popular. Well, what you can do is you can create a relationship that basically performs a type of filtering, where the filter says, I only want you to give me all of the job titles that happened between the beginning of a year and the end of a year. So I would be able to, within FileMaker, say I only want to present to the users as a list of options, values that they can choose from, those values of the job titles that happened within 2017 or 2018. Completely possible, and it's all done by making this selection right here. Think of this as a filtered value list, because this filtered value list is going to go through a relationship, and that relationship is what creates the filtering in terms of what the user or what the perspective of the data is when the user's on that particular layout. Now remember, this is all tied based on this notion of context. So it's when we actually start to wire things up that we will see how that actually applies. Now, rather than going into another example of this particular list, we've just discussed the first of the two variations of the ability to generate a value list based on a field. Well, we notice that we have this option right here to also display values from a second field. So this is where we get into more advanced FileMaker development, where rather than using the pure values that we want to actually provide, in this case, when I say pure value, I'm thinking of job title as being the pure value. But the abstract value that we're never going to be showing a user is typically the primary key. Now, the primary key, it's pretty straightforward. Don't make this any more confusing than it is. It is something that is absolutely unique to you, to a given record. It's just like your DNA. On this planet, you are the only person that has your DNA. That's your personal primary key, is your DNA. You could say that your phone number is, but once you go across certain boundaries, you may have the same string of digits. Really, the only thing that's unique to you is your DNA. So in a database system, when you assign a primary key, many times that primary key is what's used between relationships because it's the absolute unique thing between two things being connected, and we want to use that. But that doesn't make sense to the users. A person doesn't look at my DNA. They don't know me based on my DNA. They know me based on my name. So in that regards, what you would do is you'll see a relationship or a value list that will be based on a customer ID, some type of unique value, the DNA of the record, let's say. But then what you want to present is you want to present the human readable or the name that is associated to that particular record, the thing that's easy for a user to recognize. So this is your most advanced type of value list within FileMaker. It's one where you're going to, underneath the hood, you're going to return and use the DNA or the ID, but you're going to present to the user a nice, comfortable display value, something the user can actually choose from. And if you do this through a relationship, through a filter, you're getting down a narrower set of values that you want to return, or precisely what you want to return in order to give that to the user. Now that's where this option comes into play. Whenever you do this, I'm going to use the primary key or the ID of the DNA of the record, but I'm going to use the nice human readable presentation. Well, that's where you're going to actually choose this option. In fact, I can't say that in my lifetime of working with FileMaker where I've chosen or used both of these, one at being a hidden value, the first column, the second being the presentation column or the presentation value, I can't say I know of a time where I have not checked this box. I'm sure there are situations out there, but I think for the most part, I'm probably safe to say, and other FileMaker developers can check me on this, you can probably check this box almost 95% of the time, 98% of the time, whenever you're going to choose these two. Rarely have I ever said I want to choose, well, this is a sort, but rarely have I chosen where I don't want to show only the second field. Now, this does actually allow you to sort them based on the first field versus the second field. Most of the time, it wouldn't make sense because that first field is a primary key, and it's usually based on numbers or it's based on a string of digits. And so sorting based on that first one, there's as many times you probably wouldn't. Now, one thing that will come into play, depending on what you're showing within the value list, and this really hinges on the way that FileMaker's index works, and we'll talk about this much later. Rarely will you need to choose this option, but going from whatever native language you're working on and switching to something else, in this particular case, the one I probably won't show. Let's zoom out here. It's down at the bottom here. This one might come into play somewhere, Unicode, and when we're talking about fields, I'll actually give you some clues about what Unicode does versus whatever native language you're actually using when you're using FileMaker, but that's probably going to be pretty rare in terms of what you're going to do within FileMaker. All right. So I think that's a pretty good explanation of the value list dialog and how you actually interact with it. Now I want to show you how the users are going to interact with it and show you those few options that I sort of alluded to at the beginning of when we started this video. So when it comes to custom values, I told you that there are two ways that you can actually modify these values. One way is limited to you as the developer. You have to come in and you're responsible for making the change. So your boss calls up or somebody says, hey, can we add a new value to this value list? Well, if you're the only one with full access to the file, you've got to come into the Manage Value List dialog box and you've got to add it to this particular list. If you don't want to have to do that, there's only one way that you can do it when you choose custom values, and it's within the user interface where you actually set the options on the layout. So I'm going to cancel out of the dialog here. We'll discard all of the changes, whatever I made. I'm going to go into layout mode with Command L, and we could use an existing field on here, but I'm just going to drag out a new one by selecting that. Actually, what's probably a better place to go is to switch to the actual invoices. I'm going to go and switch to this one, Invoices Details, because that's where we had that status field. And rather than messing with all the fields, I'm going to drag out a field here, and I am going to switch my context. It was defaulted to this one right here, and we'll talk about context and the double colons and what that means. I'm going to switch to the current context, that's the current table, and I'm going to choose status right here. Now status, as we know, we have a value list option that we can work with, and the only way that we can work with elements in layout mode in FileMaker is when we view our inspector. So if your inspector is not showing, go ahead and choose the inspector. That's going to bring up our little palette right here where we get to control all of the different settings when we're working in the edit view mode or the layout mode as FileMaker calls it. We're going to switch to the fourth of the 4 tabs within the inspector. And we control everything with regards to a field. And let's see if I can do this side by side here. With this item right here, the control style is where we get to say what type of control is this particular field. I'm going to choose here, and here are the options that we have. Now, a value list, when it comes to being used for a field, we are going to use that in the 4 different options of a drop-down list, a pop-up menu, a checkbox set, and a radio button. Those are the only ways that we're going to be able to actually have these be set, or where we're going to be able to display the values. So I'm going to choose this drop-down list, or let's choose the pop-up menu. And you can see right here that we've got the values from. So I'm going to choose that values from, and this is where we get all of our different value lists. I'm going to choose status. And here we can see all of our different options for that value list. I keep zooming out there. Let me zoom in right there. I'm not as close as I want to be for showing on the video. Here is the second of the options that you have. Either you control it or the user can control it. And this is where you can allow the editing of the value list. You can see that right there. We can also choose this option of allow entry of other values. And we have a nice little display option where we can include the arrow. You can see that it turns on versus it turns off. But this is really the only way that we can actually allow the user to edit that value list. So here's what I suggest. Turn off the allow editing of a value list temporarily. I'll zoom out here. I'll go into browse mode. And then we will choose this. It's got no parent records. Let's make a new record. And let's select now. So here's where we get that additional option. Right there, we can see that we get the other. Now what FileMaker is going to do is it's going to bring up, this field is not modifiable. We've got a validation on this particular field. What FileMaker would do is it would typically bring up, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually reassign this field, and I'm going to do it on something else like, I don't know, let's say type. Let's try that. Now here's something that wouldn't make sense. I'm selecting the type field, but I'm choosing the status value list. It's great. You can put any value list on any field. It really doesn't matter. And let's see if I can choose other on this. There we go. It comes up with the box that I want to show. So here's where this is the least damaging of what a user can do with regards to value lists. So here you've given the user the ability to choose other. Now what's nice about this is they can add other values, and those values can collectively become part of that index. They become part of all of the values that are in that field. But what happens is when they do it on one record, that means that it's not going to be presented on any other records. It really only applies on that one record where the user made a choice. Now let's go back into layout mode and change that field yet again. On this time, we're going to turn off the allow entry of other values, and we're going to instead allow editing of the value list. So here is the second of those 2 options. This is where I can choose, and rather than saying other, you can see that it now says edit. So if I click on edit, notice that I get the ability to actually change this value list, those static values. Well, those static values are now dynamic because I'm allowing the user to actually edit them, but let's try this. Let's get rid of due tomorrow because I'm just Joe user. I'm like, who's going to ever use due tomorrow or due today? It's just these, due, overdue, and next month or something like that. Okay, cool. What that user probably did is they probably just destroyed your value list. You can actually go in and check that by going over to Manage, Value Lists, look at our status, and lo and behold, the user just blew away the values that we wanted them to use. So this is a very tricky thing to do when it comes to value lists. FileMaker gives you that checkbox option in order to allow the editing of the value list. But if you give users the ability to edit the value list, you have to expect that you're going to trust those users and somehow give them the direction to not blow away the value list or not do something boneheaded and basically wipe away all the values, taking away paid versus unpaid. Here's the cool thing. you can, using that other option, you can get all of the values that have been used in a particular field by pulling the index out. We'll take a look at that in another video of how you can see what the index is of a field. We're going to go through all the field options and learn everything we can about fields. I wanted to cover, for the most part, the options that you have with the most commonly used features of a value list, which is this static values. And then down the road, what we'll be doing is we'll be using this option, or we'll be going through this option of what's a little bit better in terms of giving users the ability to modify, add records, or add values, take away values, and go down the path of a little bit more complex value list. But I definitely wanted to show you all of the different options that you have when you're using a value list if you take advantage of FileMaker's most simple value list, and that is the static values. So just remember that when you are modifying that value list, that this option can be more dangerous, whereas this one is a little less dangerous, but all of the options that users enter as custom values are basically sort of hidden from you. So if you want the ultimate in control, you're probably going to be using a value list from a field. You can also see that we have this override data formatting with a value list. To be honest, I haven't used this one a whole lot in terms of taking super big advantage of it. I'd have to play with this a little bit more to actually even remember when the last time when I've used this. Everything else above it I have used. Always remember that FileMaker provides us multiple ways in order to edit things. So rather than having to go over to the Manage menu, if I actually want to manage a value list, I can always choose this little icon right here, which will basically bring me into the Edit dialog box, allow me to double click and edit the value list right away. Also, as I mentioned, value lists apply to pop-up menus, drop-down lists, checkbox sets, and radio button sets. So if I was to choose a drop-down list, the difference here in terms of these field types, which we're going to get to in another video, is that here I can actually input whatever I want directly into the field, as well as having the option of choosing from the value list itself. And there's those separators right there. Now, when we go through fields and we take a look at how fields are actually stored, we're going to recognize some unique features about value lists, and in particular, checkboxes and radio buttons. If we switch this to a checkbox set and we drag this out, and I know this is messy, but we're looking at this, we now have these checkbox sets, which is it's using a value list, just like the pop-up menu, just like the drop-down. When I check these, the way that FileMaker is actually storing them into the field is it's unique to FileMaker, or I shouldn't say unique. Other systems will store values the way that this is stored, but we're going to be getting that into another video at another time when we take a look at fields. We're right around 30 minutes, and I like to keep these videos about 30. Don't want to overwhelm everybody with a ton of stuff about FileMaker. I could go on for hours and hours. I do have the chat. Let's switch over to that, see if anybody's thrown any questions in here. We've got one question so far in today's video, and that is, can we import value lists from Excel to the value list fields? Good question. The way that you can get values into FileMaker is if you're going to use that field option. That's basically going to be the same thing as having a field and then just importing that data into a FileMaker table. For example, we can do this really quickly here. If I was going to have values in my FileMaker database, I might create a dedicated table. That's actually a really nice thing to do. So in my defined database, which I just accessed with Command-Shift-D, if the invoices status field was going to be something I was going to store in a field, I might create a dedicated table called values. That dedicated table might in turn have one additional field where I'm going to categorize all of the different values that I might use in the whole of my FileMaker system. Let's say category. So I would be able to import all of the different statuses for an invoice, and then I would categorize those as saying All of these particular values are values that can be used for invoice status. And through some really cool trickery, you can actually wire up some FileMaker relationships so that those are the only values that are extracted using FileMaker's value list dialog box saying, FileMaker, through a relationship, I want you to look into the values table, and the values table could have tens of thousands of different values that you use across your whole solution, but you're basically going to tell FileMaker via a relationship, FileMaker, I only want you to grab just those values that say that they are of the category invoice status. And then FileMaker would present you a list of the exact same things that we put here statically. Unpaid, paid, due tomorrow, due next week, due whenever. It's a really good approach to take, but it's an abstract one, and I'll have to save that for a different video if it doesn't make sense. But yes, importing value lists when used via a field is just basically importing data. Otherwise, if you want to get a list of values from Excel, just select the range of all of the values in the spreadsheet, copy those, go over to the FileMaker value list, and then just paste them into the value list. I'm in Define Database. I would need to be in the value list. Manage value lists, and you're on status, and you would just paste them here. And hopefully that answers that question. All right, let's see if we've got another question that came in here. Carol asks, can the number of each item chosen from a value list be counted, say, at the end of the day? Yes, they can. For example, if the question relates to the checkboxes that we have here, the checkboxes that are right here, if you wanted to come up with a system where, say, for example, the user has selected on this, they came in and for some reason it made sense. Here it doesn't make sense. A checkbox allows for multiple options, whereas a radio button will limit the user to one out of the choices. Maybe this would be better served as a radio button. But if I was offering multiple options and the user could choose unpaid and next month and overdue, if you wanted to track that, there's definitely a way that you would be able to do it. You can't do it just with FileMaker's value lists. You'll actually have to have something that actually notices that change, notices that the user had made a selection and selected 3. I'll give you a clue. You can control that based on looking at, FileMaker has a function called Get Record Modification Count. So you can also use a script, and you're also going to use one of the options that we're going to take a look at when we look at fields that's based on when a field is actually modified. You can actually cause things to happen or cause things in other fields to happen based on auto-enter fields. And so we'll look at auto-enter fields as we move forward in the series. But again, that's probably way more in depth than just straight value lists. All right, and let's see, we've got another question. I had issues with value lists this weekend. You answered all my questions. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Jeffrey. And also, for those of you, there's somebody that before I even start streaming this, because I'm recording them live, they're giving me the thumbs up on the series. So thank you, whoever's doing that. It helps me out with YouTube's rankings and gets me more exposure. If you are interested in being notified about these videos, you can. I'll switch over to it, and really briefly we'll go over here, switch that. You can sign up. You can do that on the magazine site. Go to FileMakerMagazine.com, put in the www if you want, and then what you'll see is this little button right here where we have the mastery course. If you're watching this much later and the website's been redesigned, then you can always come onto the website, use the search, click on training, what have you. If you're interested in learning more about FileMaker, I provide advanced and upper intermediate videos on my magazine site weekly. Otherwise, this video series is really for those of you that are trying to learn FileMaker and do it in depth. So I think that's probably going to give us a nice wrap to this video with regards to value lists. Again, if you're watching this after the fact and you didn't have the opportunity to put a question into the chat like our folks here have, please put it down into the comments. As I do with all of my videos, I wish everybody much luck and happy file making. Until I see you on the next video, I'll ramp up my music and then we will say goodbye. So until next time, see you later.